Hi students, welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 4 Ecosystem Dynamics. Well, we've reached the end. This is the last video, number 20, and we're going to be looking at restoration. In this case, we're going to concentrate on land degradation and agriculture. So what we want to do is to be able to investigate practices used to restore damaged ecosystems, country or place, for example, land degradation from agricultural practices. Australia is a big continent, and a large portion of that is just not suitable for pretty much anything, really. But we have used as much as we possibly can of the available land that's at least arable, that we can use for different purposes, for urbanisation, but also for agriculture. And this has come at a bit of a cost, and we'll examine some of the impacts of agriculture as we move through this video. This is a nice little visual which shows how Australia basically can be divided up on the basis of different types of land use. So you can see a large section in the middle away from the coastal margins, and also particularly towards the centre and north. Most of the grazing is of native vegetation. There's been some modified pastures, which is the yellow colour that we see here. And then the green is the cropping that includes crop and pasture rotation. So more active farming occurring in those sorts of areas. And there's also a few little spots of horticulture that are identified in smaller patches around the country as well. This gives you a nice little general idea of or the sorts of parts of Australia that have been used for different agricultural practices. But what are some of the implications of agriculture on the land? Well, I think you can make a list of these, and it's probably useful for you to do so. And as you go through each of these, just to check them off, A, that you're aware of the problem that's associated with each of these practices, each of these components of agriculture, and the actual impact that they have. So, for example, if we were going to talk about soil erosion, we could talk about the fact that this is basically when you clear the land, when you remove the vegetation, you expose the soil, there's a much higher likelihood that you're going to increase the rate of erosion. So erosion is associated with the agents of wind, water and ice, and the first two of those are the most relevant ones for the Australian situation. We need to think about some of the ways that we might be able to prevent this, or at least reduce this from happening. Land clearing is going to create some challenges for us, but what we want to try and do is A, not leave soil fallow for long periods of time. Some of the crop rotations can help to enrich the soils without necessarily using lots of fertilizers on them. Reduction in stocking rates. One of the problems with a lot of the hoofed animals is that they can compact the soils, so that can also benefit from doing some sort of a rotational grazing. Trying to retain some level of stubble after harvest so that you've still got some vegetation coverage, which again is trying to act against that exposure of the soil and an increase in soil erosion. Growing crops on slopes, or using channels or terraces or riparian buffer zones. This is basically plants that are planted around, say, a lake or a dam or a stream that again stops all of the runoff from other areas going straight into the waterway. So you get this buffer system that helps to reduce riverbank erosion, but it also helps to reduce runoff from other areas going straight in. It kind of acts as a little bit of a filter. A number of agricultural practices use drip irrigation instead of flood irrigation, and this is important because this reduces the speed of the water, which is going to again decrease the chances of soil erosion occurring. The second area that we're looking at is salination, and salination is very much about the salt levels. The salination is a bit of a problem in Australia. It's salt that comes rising from the water table up to the surface. Then when the water evaporates, the salt is left behind. This can create major problems, and it can be exacerbated by shallow root plants. So being able to plant deep-rooted perennial plants can help to mitigate against that. Adding mulch into garden beds using salt-tolerant plants. There's a number of different plant species that we see. The salt bush is probably the most obvious one that springs to mind, that are tolerant of higher salt levels than other plants, and also are thinking about the methods of irrigation that are going to either encourage a raising of the water table and perhaps a dissolving and a movement of salts up through the different levels in the soils and exposing them to the surface. So there's a couple of areas that we can probably try and address with agricultural practices to try and reduce the degradation associated with increased salt levels. Now, eutrophication is basically, what shall we call it, uncontrolled plant growth. And I've talked about this before. One of the things about Australian soils is they're actually quite poor, especially in nitrogen and phosphorus. So nitrates and phosphates are often added to improve the quality of the soil, which is great because that helps the plants to grow. But if those fertilizers, again, working in harmony with soil erosion, means that the fertilizers are going to be eroded, washed away from the agricultural lands, they may end up in the river systems or the water systems. And of course, the problem is that the particular fertilizers that help plants grow will help plants grow, whether or not they're actually in the river system or on the land. And so that means that we can sometimes find some uncontrolled plant growth, particularly in the area of, say, algal blooms, which can create major problems. And sometimes you'll see some of the river systems that have basically had the algae take over to the extent that the color has changed just because it's reflecting that massive growth. And the problem is the plants are at the surface because obviously they need the light for photosynthesis, but that is also going to deprive a lot of the organisms that live down in the water from oxygen and also from light. And so those two things together, often there's an increase in decomposers, so bacteria get in there as well, and this can have a devastating effect on the river systems. So eutrophication is a big concern here. Now, introduced species are not just ones that we've specifically looked at for things like biological control. So you can think specifically of the impact of things like cane toads and what they've done to our environment. But we've also, when we're talking about introduced species, we're talking about things like cattle, sheep, goats, horses, which we've used for work, for transport, camels. Lots of different types of species that have been introduced into the country, some of them for food, some of them for work or transport. And in each of these areas, we've had to think about what sort of impact, or sometimes we haven't thought enough about what sort of impact they're actually having on the Australian environment. Sometimes, and certainly what is the case now, is that animals that are brought into the country undergo strict quarantine procedures that tries to ensure that we're not bringing things into the country that we know are potentially going to pass diseases on, or perhaps are going to infect the local populations. We're trying to do a little bit more around ecological management and what sort of impact these new species might have on the environment. We're also looking at perhaps thinking about some of the unsuccessful methods of biological control and thinking about whether or not there are other ways of being able to do that more efficiently. Land clearing is obviously a practice that goes hand in hand with agriculture because we need the land to grow the crops or to grow the food for the livestock, to graze the livestock. So each of these can require certain amounts of land in order for us to do that, and this can devastate the local communities. And of course, remember that we're still talking about how this is going to impact on local ecosystems. And obviously, if you're clearing land, you're removing a lot of habitats, which means you're removing some of the species. So we're going to lose some richness, we're going to lose some biodiversity, but we're also potentially going to have flow-on effects into other areas of the food web. And finally, pesticides and herbicides and how we use these. More integrated pest management strategies that think about how we can holistically look at managing the animals or plants that we don't want to be in certain places. Of course, in some of our introduced species, we've also had things like rabbits and mice and rats, which we haven't necessarily chosen to bring, but we brought anyway. They've hidden on ships or they've been able to get in with people who've arrived in the country and gone berserk. And so we want to get rid of them, just as we want to get rid of a lot of the weeds, which are basically just plants that are growing in the wrong place. And we can do this with chemical means. We can also try and think about ways of being able to deal with these things in a more holistic kind of a manner. And of course, some of these things are also, if we're using chemical means, for example, we're going to introduce them into the soils, and from the soils they are also going to get in potentially into our water systems. So land degradation is a significant issue, and it's one that we do need to think about how we are dealing with each of these different problems, each of these components of agriculture, and whether or not there are better ways of doing things. And of course, there always are two books which I've read recently that I really quite enjoyed. One, which is the Australian situation. So Peter Andrews, he was actually featured on Australian Story some time ago, and his natural sequence farming processes really do look at restoring particularly the water into areas of agriculture just by thinking more smart, more cleverly about where the water is under the surface and creating natural channels for it to remain rather than having it basically disappear off the land. Wilding is a process, an experiment that occurred in Knepp in West Sussex. They had to completely restructure everything that they were going to do and try and rewild that particular area of what used to be farmland in order to try and see if that would work, see if they could encourage species which hadn't been found in that area for years, and they were able to bring them back. A really interesting story. These are ways of doing agriculture differently to the way that it's traditionally done, and both of these books and a lot of others as well are having success in moving away, trying to get into a more organic form of agriculture that respects the land, that respects the native species, and tries to utilize the best components of the environment that each of those agricultural places finds themselves in. So again, another relatively long video as we try and cover so many different things, and hopefully there's lots of talking points here that you'll be able to work through, lots of issues that you can think about in relation to agriculture and the sort of impact that it has not just on the land but also flowing out into the native ecosystems that rely so much on that land. And that brings us to an end of Ecosystem Dynamics. Thanks for watching.